The impression forces itself upon one that men measure by false standards, that everyone seeks power, success, and riches for himself, and admires others who attain them, while undervaluing the truly precious things in life. And yet, in making any general judgment of this kind, one is in danger of forgetting the manifold variety of humanity and its mental life. There are certain men from whom their contemporaries do not withhold veneration, although their greatness rests on attributes which are completely foreign to the aims and ideals of the multitude. One might well be inclined to suppose that, after all, it is only a minority who appreciate these great men, while the majority cares nothing for them. But the discrepancy between men's opinions and their behavior is so wide, and their desires so many-sided, that things are probably not so simple. One of these exceptional men calls himself my friend in his letters to me. I had sent him my little book, which treats of religion as an illusion, and he answered that he agreed entirely with my views, but that he was sorry that I had not properly appreciated the ultimate source of religious sentiments. This consists in a peculiar feeling, which never leaves him personally, and which he finds shared by many others, and which he may suppose millions more also experience. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, something oceanic. It is, he says, a purely subjective experience, not an article of belief. It implies no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source of the religious spirit, taken hold of by the various churches, directed by them into definite channels, and also, no doubt, used up within them. One may rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even though one reject all beliefs and all illusions. These views expressed by my friend, whom I so greatly honor, and who himself, once in poetry, described the magic of illusion. They put me in a difficult position, for I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings. One may attempt to describe their physiological signs, but where knowledge fails, we must turn to the origin. Where that is impossible, I said, I am afraid the oceanic feeling, too, will defy this kind of classification. Nothing remains but to turn to the ideational content, which most readily associates itself with the feeling. If I have understood my friend aright, he means the same thing as that consolation offered by an original and somewhat unconventional writer to his hero contemplating suicide. Out of this world we cannot fall. So it is a feeling of indissoluble connection, of belonging inseparably to the external world as a whole. To me, personally, this seems something more in the nature of an intellectual judgment, not, it is true, without any accompanying feeling tone, but with one of a kind which characterizes other equally far-reaching reflections as well. I could not, in my own person, convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. On that account, deny that it in fact occurs in other people. One can only wonder whether it has been correctly interpreted, and whether it is entitled to be acknowledged as the fons et origo, the fountain and source of the whole need for religion. I have nothing to suggest which could effectively settle the solution of this problem. The idea that man should receive intimation of his connection with the surrounding world by a direct feeling sounds so strange. It is so incongruous with the structure of our psychology that one is justified in attempting a psychoanalytic, a genetic explanation of such a feeling. Normally, there is nothing we are more certain of than the feeling of ourself, our own ego. It seems to us an independent, unitary thing, sharply outlined against everything else. But this is a deceptive appearance. On the contrary, the ego extends inwards, without any sharp delimitation, into an unconscious mental entity, which we call the ID. The ego is but a facade for the ID. But towards the outer world, at any rate, the ego seems to keep itself clearly and sharply outlined. There is only one state of mind in which it fails to do this, an unusual state, it is true, one that can be judged as pathological. At its height, the state of being in love threatens to obliterate the boundaries between ego and object. Against all the evidence of his senses, the man in love declares that he and his beloved are one, and he is prepared to behave as if it were a fact, a thing that can be temporarily effaced by a physiological function must also be liable to disturbance. From pathology, we have come to know a large number of states in which the boundary lines between ego and outer world become uncertain. Cases in which parts of a man's own body, even component parts of his own mind, appear to him alien and not belonging to himself. Other cases in which a man ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in himself. So the ego's cognizance of itself is subject to disturbance, and the boundaries between it and the outer world are not immovable. Further reflection shows, I said, that the adult's sense of his own ego cannot have been the same from the beginning. It must have undergone a development, a reconstruction of the soul's history. When the infant at the breast receives stimuli, he cannot as yet distinguish. He does not know whether the sensations come from himself or from the outer world. He learns it gradually. He notices that some sources of excitement, his own bodily organs, are always with him, but others, among these, what he wants most of all, his mother's breast, become temporarily out of his reach. They reappear only as a result of his cries for help. Thus, an object first presents itself to the ego as something existing outside, something which is only induced to appear by a particular act. Then comes the pain, the unavoidable and manifold unpleasantness of the world, which rules the infant, with unrestricted domination, bids him abolish or avoid these sensations. The tendency arises to dissociate from the ego everything which can give rise to pain, to cast it out, and to create a pure pleasure ego, in contrast to a threatening outside, the not self. But the limits of this pleasure ego cannot escape readjustment. The child learns that much he wants to keep is outside, and much he wants to eject is inside. He learns the reality principle, the capacity for distinguishing between the internal and the external. In this way, the ego detaches itself from the world. but it is more correct to say, originally, the ego includes everything. Later, it detaches from itself the external world. The ego feeling we are aware of now is thus only a shrunken vestige, a small remnant of a far more extensive feeling, a feeling which once embraced the universe, an inseparable connection between the self and the world. If we may suppose, I said, that this primary feeling has been preserved in the minds of many people, it would coexist like a sort of counterpart alongside the narrower and more sharply outlined ego feeling of maturity. The ideational content belonging to it would be precisely the notion of limitless extension and oneness with the universe. The same feeling described as oceanic. But have we any right to assume that the original type of feeling survives alongside the later one which has developed from it? Undoubtedly we have. There is nothing unusual in such a phenomenon. Consider the animals. We hold the view that the most highly developed have arisen from the lowest. Yet we still find all the simple forms alive today. The great saurians are extinct. They have made way for the mammals. But a typical representative of them, the crocodile, is still living among us. In the realm of mind, on the other hand, the primitive type is so commonly preserved alongside the transformations which have developed out of it. It is a bifurcation. One part of an attitude has survived unchanged, while another has undergone further development. This brings us close to a more general problem, the problem of conservation in the mind. We once erred in supposing that ordinary forgetting signified destruction or annihilation of the memory trace. We are now inclined to the opposite view, that nothing once formed in the mind could ever perish, that everything survives in some way or other, and is capable under certain conditions of being brought to light again. Let us try to picture what this signifies. By a comparison taken from another field, let us choose the history of the eternal city as an example, Rome. Historians tell us that the oldest Rome was the Roma Quadrata, a fenced settlement on the Palatine. Then followed the phase of the Septimontium, a federation of the settlements on the Seven Hills, and then the city bounded by the Servian Wall. Now, let us suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity, an entity with a past equally long and rich, an entity in which nothing that has once come into existence has passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. Of all, I said, was the Roma Quadrata, a fenced settlement on the Palatine. Then followed the phase of the Septimontium, when the colonies on the different hills united together. Then the town, which was bounded by the Servian Wall. And later still, after all the transformations in the periods of the Republic and the early Caesars, the city which the Emperor Aurelian enclosed by his walls. We will not follow the changes the city went through any further, but will ask ourselves what traces of these early stages in its history a visitor to Rome may still find today. If he goes equipped with the most complete historical and topographical knowledge, except for a few gaps, he will see the wall of Aurelian almost unchanged. He can find sections of the Servian rampart at certain points where it has been excavated and brought to light. If he knows enough, more than present-day archaeology, he may perhaps trace out in the structure of the town the whole course of this wall, and the outline of Roma Quadrata, of the buildings which once occupied this ancient ground plan. He will find nothing, or but meager fragments, for they exist no longer. With the best information about Rome of the Republican era, the utmost he could achieve would be to indicate the sites where the temples and public buildings of that period stood. These places are now occupied by ruins, but the ruins are not those of the early buildings themselves, but of restorations of them in later times, after fires and demolitions. It is hardly necessary to mention that all these remains exist no longer, of ancient Rome, are found woven into the fabric of a great metropolis, which has arisen in the last few centuries since the Renaissance. There is assuredly much that is ancient still buried in the soil, or under the modern buildings of the town. This is the way in which we find antiquities surviving in historic cities like Rome. Now let us make the fantastic supposition that Rome were not a human dwelling place, but a mental entity with just as long and varied a past history, that is, in which nothing once constructed had perished, and all the earlier stages of development had survived alongside the latest. This would mean that in Rome, the palaces of the Caesars were still standing on the Palatine, and the Septizonium of Septimius Severus was still towering to its old height, that the beautiful statues were still standing in the colonnade of the castle of St. Angelo, up to its siege by the Goths, and so on. But more still, where the Palazzo Caffarelli stands, there would also be, without this being removed, the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, not merely in its latest form, moreover, as the Romans of the Caesars saw it, but also in its earliest shape, when it still wore an Etruscan design and was adorned with terracotta antefixae. Where the Colosseum stands now, we could at the same time admire Nero's Golden House. On the piazza of the Pantheon, we should find not only the Pantheon of today as bequeathed to us by Hadrian, but on the same site also Agrippa's original edifice. Indeed, the same ground would support the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and the old temple over which it was built, and the observer would need merely to shift the focus of his eyes, perhaps, or change his position in order to call up a view of either the one or the other. There is clearly no object in spinning this fantasy further. It leads to the inconceivable, or even to absurdities. If we try to represent historical sequence in spatial terms, it can only be done by juxtaposition in space. The same space will not hold two contents. Our attempt seems like an idle game. It has only one justification. It shows us how far away from mastering the idiosyncrasies of mental life we are, by treating them in terms of visual representation. There is one objection, though, to which we must pay attention. It questions our choosing in particular the past history of a city to liken to the past of the mind. Even for mental life, our assumption that everything past is preserved holds good only on condition that the organ of the mind remains intact, and its structure has not been injured by traumas or inflammation, destructive influences. Comparable to these morbid agencies are never lacking in the history of any town, even if it has had a less checkered past than Rome, even if, like London, it has hardly ever been pillaged by an enemy. Demolitions and the erection of new buildings in the place of old occur in cities which have had the most peaceful existence. Therefore, a town is from the outset unsuited for the comparison I have made of it with a mental organism. We admit this objection. We will abandon our search for a striking effect of contrast and turn to what is, after all, a closer object of comparison, the body of an animal or human being. But here, too, we find the same thing. The early stages of development are in no sense still extant. They have been absorbed into the later features for which they supplied the material. The embryo cannot be demonstrated in the adult. The thymus gland of childhood is replaced after puberty by connective tissue, but no longer exists itself. In the marrow bone of a grown man, I can, it is true, trace the outline of the childish bone structure, but this latter no longer survives in itself. It lengthened and thickened until it reached its final form. The fact is that a survival of all the early stages, alongside the final form, is only possible in the mind, and that it is impossible for us to represent a phenomenon of this kind in visual terms. Perhaps we are going too far with this conclusion. Perhaps we ought to be content with the assertion that what is past in the mind can survive and need not necessarily perish. It is always possible that even in the mind, much that is old may be so far obliterated or absorbed, whether normally or by way of exception, that it cannot be restored or reanimated by any means, or that survival of it is always connected with certain favorable conditions. It is possible, but we know nothing about it. We can only be sure that it is more the rule than the exception for the past to survive in the mind. Thus, we are entirely willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists in many people, and we are disposed to relate it to an early stage in ego feeling. The further question then arises, what claim do we have on that past? Does this feeling have to be regarded as the source of the need for religion? To me, I said, this claim does not seem very forcible. Surely a feeling can only be a source of energy when it is itself the expression of a strong need. The derivation of a need for religion from the child's feeling of helplessness and the longing it evokes for a father. It seems to me incontrovertible, especially since this feeling is not simply carried on from childhood days, but is kept alive perpetually by the fear of what the superior power of fate will bring. I could not point to any need in childhood so strong as that for a father's protection. Thus, the part played by the oceanic feeling, which I suppose seeks to reinstate limitless narcissism, cannot possibly take the first place. The derivation of the religious attitude can be followed back in clear outline, as far as the child's feeling of helplessness. But for the present, it is wrapped in obscurity. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling could become connected with religion later on. That feeling of oneness with the universe, which is its ideational content, sounds very like a first attempt at the consolations of religion, like another way taken by the ego of denying the dangers it sees threatening it in the external world. I must again confess that I find it very difficult to work with these intangible quantities. Another friend of mine, whose insatiable scientific curiosity has impelled him to the most out-of-the-way researches and to the acquisition of encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that the yogi, by their practices of withdrawal from the world, concentrating attention on bodily functions, peculiar methods of breathing, actually are able to produce new sensations and diffused feelings in themselves, which he regards as regressions to primordial, deeply buried mental states. He sees in them a physiological foundation, so to speak, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. There would be connections to be made here, with many obscure modifications of mental life, such as trance and ecstasy. But I am moved to exclaim, in the words of Schiller's diver, who breathes overhead in the rose-tinted light, may be glad. We have reached the limits of the light. Freud has shown us that our gods are but the shadows of our fathers, and our peace but a memory of the cradle. But if the soul still longs for that rose-tinted light, can science ever truly explain it away? Subscribe to the classic mind as we descend deeper into the discontents of civilization. Like the video if you seek the protection of the truth. And tell me in the comments, is religion a need or an escape? I am Jamil, and this is the classic mind. In my Future of an Illusion, I said, I was concerned much less with the deepest sources of religious feeling than with what the ordinary man understands by his religion. That system of doctrines and pledges that on the one hand explains the riddle of this world to him with an enviable completeness, and on the other assures him that a solicitous providence is watching over him, and will make up to him in a future existence for any shortcomings in this life. The ordinary man cannot imagine this providence in any other form but that of a greatly exalted Father, for only such a one could understand the needs of the sons of men, or be softened by their prayers, and placated by the signs of their remorse. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so incongruous with reality, that to one whose attitude to humanity is friendly, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. It is even more humiliating to discover what a large number of those alive today who must see that this religion is not tenable, yet try to defend it inch by inch as if with a series of pitiable rearguard actions. One would like to count oneself among the believers, so as to admonish the philosophers who try to preserve the God of religion by substituting for him an impersonal, shadowy, abstract principle, and say, "You shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." Some of the great men of the past did the same, but that is no justification for us. We know why they had to do so. We will now go back to the ordinary man and his religion, the only religion that ought to bear the name. Life, as we find it, is too hard for us. It entails too much pain, too many disappointments, impossible tasks. We cannot do without palliative remedies. We cannot dispense with auxiliary constructions. There are perhaps three of these means: powerful diversions of interest, which lead us to care little about our misery; substitutive gratifications, which lessen it; intoxicating substances, which make us insensitive to it. Something of this kind is indispensable. Voltaire is aiming at a diversion when he brings his Candide to a close, with the advice that people should cultivate their gardens. Scientific work is another deflection of the same kind. The substitute gratifications, such as art offers, are illusions, in contrast to reality, but none the less satisfying to the mind on that account, thanks to the place which fantasy has reserved for herself in mental life. The intoxicating substances affect our body, alter its chemical processes. It is not so simple to find a place where religion belongs in this series. We must look further afield. What is the purpose of human life has been asked times without number. It has never received a satisfactory answer. Perhaps it does not admit of such an answer. Many a questioner has added that if it should appear that life has no purpose, then it would lose all value for him. But these threats alter nothing. It looks, on the contrary, as though one had a right to dismiss this question, for it seems to presuppose that belief in the superiority of the human race, with which we are already so familiar in its other expressions. Nobody asks, what is the purpose of the lives of animals, unless peradventure they are designed to be of service to man. But this too will not hold, for with many animals man can do nothing except describe, classify, and study them, and countless species have declined to be put even to this use, by living and dying and becoming extinct before men had set eyes upon them. So, again, only religion is able to answer the question of the purpose of life. One can hardly go wrong in concluding that the idea of a purpose in life stands and falls with the religious system. We will turn, therefore, to the less ambitious problem, what the behavior of men themselves reveals as the purpose and object of their lives, what they demand of life and wish to attain in it. The answer to this can hardly be in doubt. They seek happiness. They want to become happy and to remain so. There are two sides to this striving, a positive and a negative. It aims on the one hand at eliminating pain and discomfort, on the other at the experience of intense pleasures. In its narrower sense, the word happiness relates only to the last. Thus, human activities branch off in two directions, corresponding to this double goal, according to which of the two they aim at realizing, either predominantly or even exclusively. As we see, it is simply the pleasure principle which draws up the program of life's purpose. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the very beginning. There can be no doubt about its efficiency, and yet its program is in conflict with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as with the microcosm. It simply cannot be put into execution. The whole constitution of things runs counter to it. One might say the intention that man should be happy is not included in the scheme of creation. What is called happiness, in its narrowest sense, comes from the satisfaction of pent-up needs which have reached great intensity, and by its very nature can only be a transitory experience. When any condition desired by the pleasure principle is protracted, it results in a feeling only of mild comfort. We are so constituted that we can only intensely enjoy contrasts, much less intensely states in themselves. Our possibilities of happiness are thus limited, from the start, by our very constitution. It is much less difficult to be unhappy. Suffering comes from three quarters: from our own body, which is destined to decay and dissolution, and cannot even dispense with anxiety and pain as danger signals; from the outer world, which can rage against us with the most powerful and pitiless forces of destruction; from our relations with other men. The unhappiness which has this last origin we find perhaps more painful than any other. We tend to regard it more or less as a gratuitous addition, although it cannot be any less an inevitable fate than the suffering that proceeds from other sources. It is no wonder if under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, humanity is wont to reduce its demands for happiness. Just as even the pleasure principle itself changes into the more accommodating reality principle under the influence of external environment. If a man thinks himself happy, if he has merely escaped unhappiness or weathered trouble, if in general the task of avoiding pain forces that of obtaining pleasure into the background, reflection shows that there are very different ways of attempting to perform this task, and all these ways have been recommended by the various schools of wisdom in the art of life and put into practice by men. Unbridled gratification of all desires forces itself into the foreground as the most alluring guiding principle in life. But it entails preferring enjoyment to caution and penalizes itself after short indulgence. The other methods, in which avoidance of pain is the main motive, are differentiated according to the source of the suffering against which they are mainly directed. Voluntary loneliness, isolation from others, is the readiest safeguard against the unhappiness that may arise out of human relations. We know what this means. The happiness found along this path is that of peace. Against the dreaded outer world, one can defend oneself only by turning away in some other direction. If the difficulty is to be solved single-handed, there is indeed another and a better way, that of combining with the rest of the human community and taking up the attack on nature, thus forcing it to obey human will under the guidance of science. One is working then with all for the good of all. But the most interesting methods for averting pain are those which aim at influencing the organism itself. In the last analysis, all pain is but sensation. It only exists in so far as we feel it, and we feel it only in consequence of certain characteristics of our organism. The crudest of these methods of influencing the body, but also the most effective, is the chemical one, that of intoxication. I do not think anyone entirely understands their operation, but it is a fact that there are certain substances foreign to the body, which, when present in the blood or tissues, directly cause us pleasurable sensations, but also so change the conditions of our perceptivity, that we become insensible of disagreeable sensations. The two effects not only take place simultaneously, they seem to be closely bound up with each other. But there must be substances in the chemical composition of our bodies which can do the same. For we know of at least one morbid state, that of mania, in which a condition similar to this intoxication arises without any drug being absorbed. Besides this, our normal mental life shows variations, according to which pleasure is experienced with more or less ease, and along with this goes a diminished or increased sensitivity to pain. It is greatly to be regretted that this toxic aspect of mental processes has so far eluded scientific research. The services rendered by intoxicating substances in the struggle for happiness and in warding off misery rank so highly as a benefit that both individuals and races have given them an established position within their life economy. It is not merely the immediate gain in pleasure which one owes to them, but also a measure of that independence of the outer world which is so sorely craved. Men know that with the help they can get from drowning their cares, they can at any time slip away from the oppression of reality and find a refuge in a world of their own, where painful feelings do not enter. We are aware that it is just this property which constitutes the danger and injuriousness of intoxicating substances. In certain circumstances, they are to blame when valuable energies which could have been used to improve the lot of humanity are uselessly wasted. The complicated structure of our mental apparatus admits, however, of a whole series of other kinds of influence. The gratification of instincts is happiness. But when the outer world lets us starve, refuses us satisfaction of our needs, they become the cause of very great suffering. So the hope is born that by influencing these impulses, one may escape some measure of suffering. This type of defense against pain no longer relates to the sensory apparatus. It seeks to control the internal sources of our needs themselves. An extreme form of it consists in annihilation of the instincts, as taught by the wisdom of the East and practiced by the yogi. When it succeeds, it is true, it involves giving up all other activities as well, sacrificing the whole of life. And again, by another path, the only happiness it brings is that of peace. The same way is taken when the aim is less extreme. Of the instincts is sought. When this is so, the higher mental systems, which recognize the reality principle, have the upper hand. The aim of gratification is by no means abandoned in this case. A certain degree of protection against suffering is secured, in that lack of satisfaction causes less pain when the instincts are kept in check than when they are unbridled. On the other hand, this brings with it an undeniable reduction in the degree of enjoyment obtainable. The feeling of happiness produced by indulgence of a wild, untamed craving is incomparably more intense than the satisfying of a curbed desire. The irresistibility of perverted impulses, perhaps the charm of forbidden things generally, may in this way be explained economically. Another method, I said, of guarding against pain is by using the libido displacements that our mental equipment allows of, by which it gains so greatly in flexibility. The task is then one of transferring the instinctual aims into such directions that they cannot be frustrated by the outer world. Sublimation of the instincts lends an aid in this. Its success is greatest when a man knows how to heighten sufficiently his capacity for obtaining pleasure from mental and intellectual work. Fate has little power against him then. This kind of satisfaction, such as the artist's joy in creation, in embodying his fantasies, or the scientist's in solving problems or discovering truth, has a special quality which we shall certainly one day be able to define metapsychologically. Until then, we can only say metaphorically, it seems to us higher and finer, but compared with that of gratifying, gross, primitive instincts, its intensity is tempered and diffused. It does not overwhelm us physically. The weak point of this method, however, is that it is not generally applicable. It is only available to the few. It presupposes special gifts and dispositions, which are not very commonly found in a sufficient degree. And even to these few, it does not secure complete protection against suffering. It gives no invulnerable armor against the arrows of fate, and it usually fails when a man's own body becomes a source of suffering to him. This behavior reveals clearly enough its aim, that of making oneself independent of the external world by looking for happiness in the inner things of the mind. In the next method, the same features are even more marked. The connection with reality is looser still. Satisfaction is obtained through illusions, which are recognized as such, without the discrepancy between them and reality being allowed to interfere with the pleasure they give, are derived from the life of fantasy, which, at the time when the sense of reality developed, was expressly exempted from the demands of the reality test and set apart for the purpose of fulfilling wishes, which would be very hard to realize. At the head of these fantasy pleasures stands the enjoyment of works of art, which through the agency of the artist is opened to those who cannot themselves create. Those who are sensitive to the influence of art do not know how to rate it high enough as a source of happiness and consolation in life. Yet art affects us but as a mild narcotic, and can provide no more than a temporary refuge for us from the hardships of life. Its influence is not strong enough to make us forget real misery. Another method operates more energetically and thoroughly. It regards reality as the source of all suffering, as the one and only enemy with whom life is intolerable, and with whom, therefore, all relations must be broken off, if one is to be happy in any way at all. The hermit turns his back on this world. He will have nothing to do with it. But one can do more than that. One can try to recreate it. Try to build up another instead, from which the most unbearable features are eliminated and replaced by others, corresponding to one's own wishes. He who in his despair and defiance sets out on this path will not, as a rule, get very far. Reality will be too strong for him. He becomes a madman, and usually finds no one to help him in carrying through his delusion. It is said, however, that each one of us behaves in some respect like the paranoiac, substituting a wish fulfillment for some aspect of the world which is unbearable to him, and carrying this delusion through into reality. When a large number of people make this attempt together and try to obtain assurance of happiness and protection from suffering by a delusional transformation of reality, it acquires special significance. The religions of humanity, too, must be classified as mass delusions of this kind. No one who shares a delusion recognizes it as such. I do not suppose that I have enumerated all the methods by which men strive to win happiness and keep suffering at bay. One of these methods I have not yet mentioned at all, not because I had forgotten it, but because it will interest us in another connection. How would it be possible to forget this way of all others of practicing the art of life? It is conspicuous for its remarkable capacity to combine characteristic features. Needless to say, it too strives to bring about independence of fate, and with this object, it looks for satisfaction within the mind, and uses the capacity for displacing libido. But it does not turn away from the outer world. On the contrary, it takes a firm hold of its objects, and obtains happiness from an emotional relation to them. Nor is it content to strive for avoidance of pain, that goal of weary resignation. Rather, it passes that by heedlessly, and holds fast to the deep-rooted, passionate striving for a positive fulfillment of happiness. Perhaps it really comes nearer to this goal than any other method. I am speaking, of course, of that way of life which makes love the center of all things and anticipates all happiness from loving and being loved. This attitude is familiar enough to all of us, one of the forms in which love manifests itself. Sexual love gives us our most intense experience of an overwhelming pleasurable sensation, and so furnishes a prototype for our strivings after happiness. What is more natural than that we should persist in seeking happiness along the path by which we first encountered it? The weak side of this way of living is clearly evident, and were it not for this, no human being would ever have thought of abandoning this path to happiness in favor of any other. We are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love, never so forlornly unhappy as when we have lost our love object or its love. But this does not complete the story of that way of life which bases happiness on love. There is much more to be said about it. We may here go on, I said, to consider the interesting case in which happiness in life is sought first and foremost in the enjoyment of beauty, wherever it is to be found by our senses and our judgment. The beauty of human forms and movements, of natural objects, of landscapes, of artistic and even scientific creations. As a goal in life, this aesthetic attitude offers little protection against the menace of suffering, but it is able to compensate for a great deal: the intoxication of beauty. The enjoyment of beauty produces a particular, mildly intoxicating kind of sensation. There is no very evident use in beauty. The necessity of it for cultural purposes is not apparent, and yet civilization could not do without it. The science of aesthetics investigates the conditions in which things are regarded as beautiful. it can give no explanation of the nature or origin of beauty. Its lack of results is concealed under a flood of resounding and meaningless words. Unfortunately, psychoanalysis, too, has less to say about beauty than about most things. Its derivation from the realms of sexual sensation is all that seems certain. The love of beauty is a perfect example of a feeling with an inhibited aim. Beauty and attraction are first of all the attributes of a sexual object. It is remarkable that the genitals themselves, the sight of which is always exciting, are hardly ever regarded as beautiful. The quality of beauty seems, on the other hand, to attach to certain secondary sexual characters. In spite of the incompleteness of these considerations, I will venture on a few remarks in conclusion of this discussion. The goal towards which the pleasure principle impels us of becoming happy is not attainable. Yet we may not, nay, cannot, give up the effort. To come nearer to realization of it by some means or other, very different paths may be taken towards it. Some pursue the positive aspect, attainment of pleasure, others the negative, avoidance of pain. By none of these can we achieve all that we desire. In that modified sense in which we have seen it to be attainable, happiness is a problem of the economics of the libido. There is no sovereign recipe in this matter which suits all. Each one must find out for himself by which particular means he may achieve felicity. All kinds of different factors will operate to influence his choice. It depends on how much real gratification he is likely to obtain in the external world, and how far he will find it necessary to make himself independent of it. Finally, too, on the belief he has in himself, of his power to alter it in accordance with his wishes. Even at this stage, the mental constitution of the individual will play a decisive part, aside from any external considerations. The man who is predominantly erotic will choose emotional relationships with others before all else. The narcissistic type, who is more self-sufficient, will seek his essential satisfactions in the inner workings of his own soul. The man of action will never abandon the external world, in which he can essay his power. The interests of narcissistic types will be determined by their particular gifts and the degree of instinctual sublimation of which they are capable. When any choice is pursued to an extreme, it penalizes itself, in that it exposes the individual to the dangers accompanying any one exclusive life interest, which may always prove inadequate. Just as a cautious businessman avoids investing all his capital in one concern, so wisdom would probably admonish us also not to anticipate all our happiness from one quarter alone. Success is never certain. It depends on the cooperation of many factors, perhaps on none more than the capacity of the mental constitution to adapt itself to the outer world, and then utilize this last for obtaining pleasure. Anyone who is born with a specially unfavorable instinctual constitution will find it hard to obtain happiness. One last possibility of dealing with life remains to such people. It offers them substitute gratifications. It takes the form of the flight into neurotic illness. Those whose efforts to obtain happiness come to naught in later years still find consolation in the pleasure of chronic intoxication, or else they embark upon that despairing attempt at revolt psychosis. Religion circumscribes these measures of choice and adaptation by urging upon everyone alike its single way of achieving happiness and guarding against pain. Its method consists in decrying the value of life and promulgating a view of the real world that is distorted like a delusion. At such a cost, by the forcible imposition of mental infantilism and inducing a mass delusion, religion succeeds in saving many people from individual neuroses, but little more. Nor can religion keep her promises either, when the faithful find themselves reduced in the end to speaking of God's inscrutable decree. They thereby avow that all that is left to them in their sufferings is unconditional submission, as a last remaining consolation. And if a man is willing to come to this, he could probably have arrived there by a shorter road. We are traders in the market of the soul. We invest our libido in love, in work, in beauty, hoping for a return on our happiness. But if we give it all to a single power, we risk everything on a decree we cannot understand. Thank you for finishing this chapter of human discontent with me. If Freud's cold warning to not invest all your capital in one concern has changed how you look at your own heart, then you are ready for what comes next. Subscribe to the Classic Mind as we move into Chapter 3, where we ask, why did civilization become the very source of our misery? Like the video if you choose the long road of truth, and tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you have invested most of your soul in? I am Jamil, and this is the Classic Mind. Our discussion of happiness, I said, has so far not taught us much that is not already common knowledge, nor does the prospect of discovering anything new seem much greater. If we go on with the problem, why it is so hard for mankind to be happy, we gave the answer before when we cited the three sources of human sufferings: the superior force of nature, the disposition to decay of our bodies, the inadequacy of our methods of regulating human relations in the family, the community, and the state. In regard to the first two, our judgment cannot hesitate. It forces us to recognize these sources of suffering and to submit to the inevitable. We shall never completely subdue nature. Our body, too, is an organism, itself a part of nature, and will always contain the seeds of dissolution, with its limited powers of adaptation and achievement. The effect of this recognition is in no way disheartening. On the contrary, it points out the direction for our efforts. If we cannot abolish all suffering, yet a great deal of it we can, and can mitigate more. The experience of several thousand years has convinced us of this. To the third, the social source of our distresses, we take up a different attitude. We prefer not to regard it as one at all. We cannot see why the systems we have ourselves created should not rather ensure protection and well-being for us all. To be sure, when we consider how unsuccessful our efforts to safeguard against suffering in this particular have proved, the suspicion dawns upon us that a bit of unconquerable nature lurks concealed behind this difficulty as well, in the shape of our own mental constitution. When we start to consider this possibility, we come across a point of view which is so amazing that we will pause over it. According to it, our so-called civilization itself is to blame for a great part of our misery, and we should be much happier if we were to give it up and go back to primitive conditions. I call this amazing because, however one may define culture, it is undeniable that every means by which we try to guard ourselves against menaces from the several sources of human distress is a part of this same culture. How has it come about that so many people have adopted this strange attitude of hostility to civilization? In my opinion, it arose from a background of profound, long-standing discontent, which finally crystallized into this judgment as a result of certain historical happenings. I believe I can identify the last two of these. I am not learned enough to trace the links, but I can identify them as having arisen from that background of discontent in the chain back into the history of the human species. At the time when Christianity conquered the pagan religions, some such antagonism to culture must already have been actively at work. It is closely related to the low estimation put upon earthly life by Christian doctrine. The earlier of the last two historical developments was when, as a result of voyages of discovery, men came into contact with primitive peoples and races. To the Europeans, who failed to observe them carefully and misunderstood what they saw, these people seemed to lead simple, happy lives, wanting for nothing, such as the travelers who visited them, with all their superior culture, were unable to achieve. Later experience has corrected this opinion on many points. In several instances, the ease of life was due to the bounty of nature and the possibilities of ready satisfaction for the great human needs, but it was erroneously attributed to the absence of the complicated conditions of civilization. The last of the two historical events is especially familiar to us. It was when people began to understand the nature of the neuroses, which threatens to undermine the modicum of happiness open to civilized man. It was found that men become neurotic because they cannot tolerate the degree of privation that society imposes on them in virtue of its cultural ideals. And it was supposed that a return to greater possibilities of happiness would ensue if these standards were abolished or greatly relaxed. And there exists an element of disappointment in addition. In the last generations, man has made extraordinary strides in knowledge of the natural sciences and the technical application of them. He has established his dominion over nature in a way never before imagined. The details of this forward progress are universally known. It is unnecessary to enumerate them. Mankind is proud of its exploits and has a right to be. But men are beginning to perceive that all this newly won power over space and time, this conquest of the forces of nature, this fulfillment of age-old longings, has not increased the amount of pleasure they can obtain in life, has not made them feel any happier. The valid conclusion from this is merely that power over nature is not the only condition of human happiness. Just as it is not the only goal of civilization's efforts, and there is no ground for inferring that its technical progress is worthless from the standpoint of happiness. It prompts one to exclaim, is it not then a positive pleasure, an unequivocal gain in happiness, to be able to hear, whenever I like, the voice of a child living hundreds of miles away, or to know directly a friend of mine arrives at his destination, that he has come well and safely through the long and troublesome voyage? And is it nothing that medical science has succeeded in enormously reducing the mortality of young children, the dangers of infection for women in childbirth, indeed, in very considerably prolonging the average length of human life? And there is still a long list one could add to these benefits that we owe to the much despised era of scientific and practical progress. But a critical, pessimistic voice makes itself heard, saying that most of these advantages follow the model of those cheap pleasures in the anecdote. One gets this enjoyment by sticking one's bare leg outside the bedclothes on a cold winter's night, and then drawing it in again. If there were no railway to make light of distances, my child would never have left home, and I should not need the telephone to hear his voice. If there were no vessels crossing the ocean, my friend would never have embarked on his voyage, and I should not need the telegraph to relieve my anxiety about him. What is the use of reducing the mortality of children when it is precisely this reduction which imposes the greatest moderation on us in begetting them? So that taken all round, we do not rear more children than in the days before the reign of hygiene, while at the same time we have created difficult conditions for sexual life and marriage, and probably counteracted the beneficial effects of natural selection. And what do we gain by a long life, when it is full of hardship and starved of joys, and so wretched that we can only welcome death as our deliverer? It seems to be certain, I said, that our present-day civilization does not inspire in us a feeling of well-being, but it is very difficult to form an opinion whether in earlier times people felt any happier and what part their cultural conditions played in the question. We always tend to regard trouble objectively, to place ourselves with our own wants and our own sensibilities in the same conditions, so as to discover what opportunities for happiness or unhappiness we should find in them. This method is, of course, the most subjective possible, for by applying it, one substitutes one's own mental attitude for the unknown attitude of other men. Happiness, on the contrary, is something essentially subjective. However we may shrink in horror at the thought of certain situations, the galley slaves in antiquity, the peasants in the 30 Years' War, the victims of the Inquisition, it is still impossible for us to feel ourselves into the position of these people, to imagine the differences brought about by gradual stupefaction, the cessation of all anticipation, and by all the grosser and more subtle ways in which insensibility to both pleasurable and painful sensations can be induced. It is time that we should turn our attention to the nature of this culture. The word culture describes the sum of the achievements and institutions which differentiate our lives from those of our animal forebears, and serve two purposes, namely that of protecting humanity against nature, and of regulating the relations of human beings among themselves. Man has, it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown on him, and they still give him much trouble at times. With the photographic camera, he has created an instrument which registers transitory visual impressions, just as the gramophone does with equally transient auditory ones. Both are at bottom materializations of his own power of memory. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances which even fairy tales would treat as insuperable. Writing, to begin with, was the voice of the absent. Dwellings were a substitute for the mother's womb, that first abode in which he was safe and felt so content, for which he probably yearns ever after. It sounds like a fairy tale, I said. But not only that. This story of what man, by his science and practical inventions, has achieved on this earth, where he first appeared as a weakly member of the animal kingdom, and on which each individual of his species must ever again appear as a helpless infant. O inch of nature! It is a direct fulfillment of all or of most of the dearest wishes in his fairy tales. All these possessions he has acquired through culture. Long ago, he formed an ideal conception of omnipotence and omniscience, which he embodied in his gods. Whatever seemed unattainable to his desires or forbidden to him, he attributed to these gods. One may say, therefore, that these gods were the ideals of his culture. Now he has himself approached very near to realizing this ideal. He has nearly become a god himself. But only, it is true, in the way that ideals are usually realized in the general experience of humanity. Not completely. In some respects, not at all. In others, only by halves. Man has become a god by means of artificial limbs, so to speak, quite magnificent when equipped with all his accessory organs. But they do not grow on him, and they still give him trouble at times. However, he is entitled to console himself with the thought that this evolution will not come to an end in AD 1930. Future ages will produce further great advances in this realm of culture, probably inconceivable now, and will increase man's likeness to a god still more. But with the aim of our study in mind, we will not forget, all the same, that the human being of today is not happy with all his likeness to a god. Thus we recognize that a country has attained a high level of civilization when we find that everything in it that can be helpful in exploiting the earth for man's benefit and in protecting him against nature. Everything, in short, that is useful to him is cultivated and effectively protected. In such a country, the course of rivers, which threaten to overflow their banks, is regulated, their waters guided through canals to places where they are needed. The soil is industriously cultivated and planted with the vegetation suited to it. The mineral wealth is brought up assiduously from the depths and wrought into the implements and utensils that are required. The means of communication are frequent, rapid, and reliable. Wild and dangerous animals have been exterminated. The breeding of tamed and domesticated ones prospers. But we demand other things besides these of civilization, and curiously enough, we expect to find them existing in the same countries, as if we wish to repudiate the first requisition we made. We count it also as proof of a high level of civilization, when we see that the industry of the inhabitants is applied as well to things which are not in the least useful, and on the contrary seem to be useless, e.g., when the parks and gardens in a town, which are necessary as playgrounds and air reservoirs, also bear flowering plants, or when the windows of dwellings are adorned with flowers, we soon become aware that the useless thing which we require of civilization is beauty. We expect a cultured people to revere beauty where it is found in nature, and to create it in their handiwork so far as they are able. But this is far from exhausting what we require of civilization. Besides, we expect to see the signs of cleanliness and order. We do not think highly of the cultural level of an English country town in the time of Shakespeare. When we read that there was a tall dung heap in front of his father's house in Stratford, we are indignant and call it barbarous, which is the opposite of civilized. When we find the paths in the Wiener Wald littered with paper, dirt of any kind seems to us incompatible with civilization. We extend our demands for cleanliness to the human body also, and are amazed to hear what an objectionable odor emanated from the person of the Roi Soleil. We shake our heads when we are shown the tiny wash basin on the Isola Bella, which Napoleon used for his daily ablutions. Indeed, we are not surprised if anyone employs the use of soap as a direct measure of civilization. It is the same with order, which, like cleanliness, relates entirely to man's handiwork. But whereas we cannot expect cleanliness in nature, order has, on the contrary, been imitated from nature. Man's observations of the great astronomical periodicities not only furnished him with a model, but formed the ground plan of his first attempts to introduce order into his own life. Order is a kind of repetition compulsion, by which it is ordained, once for all, when, where, and how a thing shall be done, so that on every similar occasion doubt and hesitation shall be avoided. The benefits of order are incontestable. It enables us to use space and time to the best advantage, while saving expenditure of mental energy. One would be justified in expecting that it would have ingrained itself from the start, and without opposition, into all human activities. And one may well wonder that this has not happened, and that, on the contrary, human beings manifest an inborn tendency to negligence, irregularity, and untrustworthiness in their work, and have to be laboriously trained to imitate the example of their celestial models. Beauty, cleanliness, and order clearly occupy a peculiar position among the requirements of civilization. No one will maintain that they are as essential to life as the activities aimed at controlling the forces of nature, and as other factors which we have yet to mention. And yet, no one would willingly relegate them to the background as trivial matters. Beauty is an instance which plainly shows that culture is not simply utilitarian in its aims. For the lack of beauty is a thing we cannot tolerate in civilization. The utilitarian advantages of order are quite apparent. With regard to cleanliness, we have to remember that it is required of us by hygiene, and we may surmise that even before the age of scientific prophylaxis, The connection between the two was not altogether unsuspected by mankind. But these aims and endeavors of culture are not entirely to be explained. On utilitarian lines, there must be something else at work besides. It cannot be doubted, however, that the remainder too correspond to some powerful need in human beings, perhaps to one which develops fully only in a minority of people. Nor may we allow ourselves to be misled by our own judgments concerning the value of any of these religious or philosophical systems, or of these ideals, whether we look upon them as the highest achievement of the human mind, or whether we deplore them as fallacies. One must acknowledge that where they exist, and especially where they are in the ascendant, they testify to a high level of civilization. We now have to consider, I said, the last, and certainly by no means the least important of the components of culture, namely, the ways in which social relations, the relations of one man to another, are regulated. All that has to do with him as a neighbor, a source of help, a sexual object to others, a member of a family, or of a state. It is especially difficult in this matter to remain unbiased by any ideal standards, and to ascertain exactly what is specifically cultural here. Perhaps one might begin with the statement that the first attempt ever made to regulate these social relations already contained the essential element of civilization. Had no such attempt been made, these relations would be subject to the wills of individuals. That is to say, the man who was physically strongest would decide things in accordance with his own interests and desires. The situation would remain the same, even though this strong man should in his turn meet with another who was stronger than he. Human life in communities only becomes possible when a number of men unite together in strength superior to any single individual and remain united against all single individuals. The strength of this united body is then opposed as right against the strength of any individual, which is condemned as brute force. This substitution of the power of a united number for the power of a single man is the decisive step towards civilization. The essence of it lies in the circumstance that the members of the community have restricted their possibilities of gratification, whereas the individual recognized no such restrictions. The first requisite of culture, therefore, is justice. That is the assurance that a law once made will not be broken in favor of any individual. This implies nothing about the ethical value of any such law. The further course of cultural development seems to tend towards ensuring that the law shall no longer represent the will of any small body, caste, tribe, section of the population, which may behave like a predatory individual towards other such groups, perhaps containing larger numbers. The end result would be a state of law to which all, that is, all who are capable of uniting, have contributed by making some sacrifice of their own desires, and which leaves none, again with the same exception, at the mercy of brute force. The liberty of the individual, I said, is not a benefit of culture. It was greatest before any culture, though indeed it had little value at that time, because the individual was hardly in a position to defend it. Liberty has undergone restrictions through the evolution of civilization, and justice demands that these restrictions shall apply to all. The desire for freedom that makes itself felt in a human community may be a revolt against some existing injustice, and so may prove favorable to a further development of civilization and remain compatible with it. But it may also have its origin in the primitive roots of the personality, still unfettered by civilizing influences, and so become a source of antagonism to culture. Thus, the cry for freedom is directed either against particular forms or demands of culture, or else against culture itself, could be brought by any sort of influence to change his nature into that of the ants. He will always, one imagines, defend his claim to individual freedom against the will of the multitude. A great part of the struggles of mankind centers round the single task of finding some expedient solution. Between these individual claims and those of the civilized community, it is one of the problems of man's fate, whether this solution can be arrived at in some particular form of culture, or whether the conflict will prove irreconcilable. We have obtained a clear impression of the general picture presented by culture through adopting the common view as to which aspects of human life are to be called cultural. But it is true that so far we have discovered nothing that is not common knowledge. We have, however, at the same time, guarded ourselves against accepting the misconception that civilization is synonymous with becoming perfect, is the path by which man is ordained to reach perfection. But now, a certain point of view presses for consideration. It will lead, perhaps, in another direction. The evolution of culture seems to us a peculiar kind of process, passing over humanity, of which several aspects strike us as familiar. We can describe this process in terms of the modifications it effects on the known human instinctual dispositions, which it is the economic task of our lives to satisfy. Some of these instincts become absorbed, as it were, so that something appears in place of them, which in an individual we call a character trait. The most remarkable example of this process is found in respect of the anal eroticism of young human beings. Their primary interest in the excretory function, its organs and products, is changed in the course of their growth into a group of traits that we know well: thriftiness, orderliness, and cleanliness. Valuable and welcome qualities in themselves, which, however, may be intensified till they visibly dominate the personality and produce what we call the anal character. How this happens, we do not know, but there is no doubt about the accuracy of this conclusion. Now we have seen that order and cleanliness are essentially cultural demands, although the necessity of them for survival is not particularly apparent, any more than their suitability as sources of pleasure. At this point, we must be struck, for the first time, with the similarity between the process of cultural development and that of the libidinal development in an individual. Other instincts have to be induced to change the conditions of their gratification, to find it along other paths, a process which is usually identical with what we know so well as sublimation. Sublimation of instinct is an especially conspicuous feature of cultural evolution. This it is that makes it possible for the higher mental operations, scientific, artistic, ideological activities to play such an important part in civilized life. Thirdly and lastly, and this seems most important of all, it is impossible to ignore the extent to which civilization is built up on renunciation of instinctual gratifications. The degree to which the existence of civilization presupposes the non-gratification, suppression, repression, or something else, of powerful instinctual urgencies. This cultural privation dominates the whole field of social relations between human beings. We know already that it is the cause of the antagonism against which all civilization has to fight. It is not easy to understand how it can become possible to withhold satisfaction from an instinct, nor is it by any means without risk to do so. If the deprivation is not made good economically, one may be certain of producing serious disorders. But now, if we wish to know what use it is to us to have recognized the evolution of culture as a special process, comparable to the normal growth of an individual to maturity, we must clearly attack another problem and put the question: what are the influences to which the evolution of culture owes its origin? How did it arise? And what determined its course? This task, I said, seems too big a one. One may well confess oneself diffident. Here follows what little I have been able to elucidate about it. Once primitive man had made the discovery that it lay in his own hands, speaking literally, to improve his lot on earth by working. It cannot have been a matter of indifference to him whether another man worked with him or against him. The other acquired the value of a fellow worker, and it was advantageous to live with him. Even earlier, in his ape-like prehistory, man had adopted the habit of forming families. His first helpers were probably the members of his family. One may suppose that the founding of families was in some way connected with the period when the need for genital satisfaction no longer appearing like an occasional guest who turns up suddenly and then vanishes without letting one hear anything of him for long intervals, had settled down with each man like a permanent lodger. When this happened, the male acquired a motive for keeping the female, or rather his sexual objects, near him, while the female, who wanted not to be separated from her helpless young, in their interest too, had to stay by the stronger male. In this primitive family, one essential feature of culture is lacking. The will of the father, the head of it, was unfettered. I have endeavored in Totem on Taboo to show how the way led from this family life to the succeeding phase of communal existence, in the form of a band of brothers. By overpowering the father, the sons had discovered that several men united can be stronger than a single man. The totemic stage of culture is founded upon the restrictions that the band were obliged to impose on one another in order to maintain the new system. These taboos were the first right or law. The life of human beings in common therefore had a twofold foundation: the compulsion to work created by external necessity, the power of love causing the male to wish to keep his sexual object, the female, near him, and the female to keep near her that part of herself that was the male, the father, in the new generation. which has become detached from her, her child. Eros and Ananke were the parents of human culture too. The first result of culture was that a larger number of human beings could then live together in common. We said that man, having found by experience that sexual love afforded him his greatest gratification, so that it became, in effect, a prototype of all happiness to him, must have been thereby impelled to seek his happiness further along the path of sexual relations. But in so doing, he becomes to a very dangerous degree dependent on a part of the outer world, namely on his chosen love object, and this exposes him to most painful sufferings, if he is rejected by it or loses it through death or defection. The wise men of all ages have consequently warned us emphatically against this way of life. But in spite of all, it retains its attraction for a great number of people. A small minority, I said, are enabled by their constitution, nevertheless, to find happiness along the path of love. But far-reaching mental transformations of the erotic function are necessary before this is possible. These people make themselves independent of their object's acquiescence by transferring the main value from the fact of being loved to their own act of loving. They protect themselves against loss of it by attaching their love not to individual objects, but to all men equally. And they avoid the uncertainties and disappointments of genital love by turning away from its sexual aim, modifying the instinct into an impulse with an inhibited aim. The state which they induce in themselves by this process, an unchangeable, undeviating, tender attitude. It seems that Saint Francis of Assisi may have carried this method of using love to produce an inner feeling of happiness as far as anyone. From one ethical standpoint, this inclination towards an all-embracing love of others and of the world at large is regarded as the highest state of mind, of which man is capable. Even at this early stage, I will not withhold the two principal objections we have to raise. A love that does not discriminate seems to us to lose some of its own value, since it does an injustice to its object. And secondly, not all men are worthy of love. The love that instituted the family still retains its power. In its original form, it does not stop short of direct sexual satisfaction. And in its modified form, as aim-inhibited friendliness, it influences our civilization. In both these forms, it carries on its task of binding men and women to one another. And it does this with greater intensity than can be achieved through the interest of work in common. The casual and undifferentiated way in which the word love is employed by language has its genetic justification. In general usage, the relation between a man and a woman whose genital desires have led them to found a family is called love. But the positive attitude of feeling between parents and children, between brothers and sisters, is also called love. Love with an inhibited aim was indeed originally full sensual love. It is so still. Both of them, the sensual and the aim-inhibited forms, reach out beyond the family and create new bonds with others who before were strangers. Genital love leads to the forming of new families. Aim-inhibited love leads to friendships, which are valuable culturally because they do not entail many of the limitations of genital love, for instance, its exclusiveness. But the interrelations between love and culture lose their simplicity as development proceeds. On the one hand, love opposes the interests of culture. On the other, culture menaces love with grievous restrictions. This lift between them, I said, seems inevitable. The cause of it is not immediately recognizable. It expresses itself first in a conflict between the family and the larger community to which the individual belongs. We have seen already that one of culture's principal endeavors is to cement men and women together into larger units. But the family will not give up the individual. The closer the attachment between the members of it, the more they often tend to remain aloof from others, and the harder it is for them to enter into the wider circle of the world at large. That form of life in common, which is phylogenetically older, and is in childhood its only form, resists being displaced by the type that becomes acquired later with culture. Detachment from the family has become a task that awaits every adolescent, and often society helps him through it. With pubertal and initiatory rites, one gets the impression that these difficulties form an integral part of every process of mental evolution, and indeed, at bottom of every organic development, too. The next discord is caused by women, who soon become antithetical to cultural trends and spread around them their conservative influence. The women who at the beginning laid the foundations of culture by the appeal of their love. Women represent the interests of the family and sexual life. The work of civilization has become more and more men's business. It confronts them with ever harder tasks, compels them to sublimations of instinct, which women are not easily able to achieve. Since man has not an unlimited amount of mental energy at his disposal, he must accomplish his tasks by distributing his libido to the best advantage. What he employs for cultural purposes, he withdraws to a great extent from women and his sexual life. His constant association with men and his dependence on his relations with them even estrange him from his duties as husband and father. Woman finds herself thus forced into the background by the claims of culture, and she adopts an inimical attitude towards it. The tendency of culture to set restrictions upon sexual life is no less evident than its other aim of widening its sphere of operations. Even the earliest phase of it, the totemic, brought in its train the prohibition against incestuous object choice, perhaps the most maiming wound ever inflicted throughout the ages on the erotic life of man. Further limitations are laid on it by taboos, laws, and customs. We have seen that culture obeys the laws of psychological economic necessity in making the restrictions, for it obtains a great part of the mental energy it needs by subtracting it from sexuality. Culture behaves towards sexuality in this respect like a tribe which has gained the upper hand and is exploiting the rest to its own advantage. Fear of a revolt among the oppressed then becomes a motive for even stricter regulations. A high watermark in this type of development has been reached in our Western European civilization. Psychologically, it is fully justified in beginning by censuring any manifestations of the sexual life of children, for there would be no prospect of curbing the sexual desires of adults if the ground had not been prepared for it in childhood. Nevertheless, There is no sort of justification for the lengths beyond this to which civilized society goes in actually denying the existence of these manifestations, which are not merely demonstrable, but positively glaring. Where sexually mature persons are concerned, object choice is further narrowed down to the opposite sex, and most of the extragenital forms of satisfaction are interdicted as perversions. The standard which declares itself in these prohibitions is that of a sexual life identical for all, to the disparities in the inborn and acquired sexual constitutions of individuals, and cuts off a considerable number of them from sexual enjoyment, thus becoming a cause of grievous injustice. The only outlet, not thus censured, heterosexual genital love, is further circumscribed by the barriers of legitimacy and monogamy. Present-day civilization gives us plainly to understand that sexual relations are permitted only on the basis of a final, indissoluble bond between a man and a woman, that sexuality as a source of enjoyment for its own sake is unacceptable to it, and that its intention is to tolerate it only as the hitherto irreplaceable means of multiplying the human race. Gemini said, "This, of course," I said, "represents an extreme. Everyone knows that it has proved impossible to put it into execution, even for short periods. Only the weaklings have submitted to such comprehensive interference with their sexual freedom, and stronger natures have done so only under one compensatory condition, of which mention may be made later. Civilized society has felt itself obliged to pass over in silence many transgressions which, by its own ordinances, it ought to have penalized. This does not justify anyone, however, in leaning towards the other side, and assuming that because it does not achieve all it aims at, such an attitude on the part of society is altogether harmless. The sexual life of civilized man is seriously disabled, whatever we may say. It sometimes makes an impression of being a function in process of becoming atrophied, just as organs like our teeth and our hair seem to be. One is probably right in supposing that the importance of sexuality as a source of pleasurable sensations, i.e., as a means of fulfilling the purpose of life, has perceptibly decreased. Sometimes one imagines, one perceives, that it is not only the oppression of culture, but something in the nature of the function itself that denies us full satisfaction and urges us in other directions. This may be an error. It is hard to decide. Psychoanalytic work, I said, has shown that these frustrations in respect of sexual life are especially unendurable to the so-called neurotics among us. These persons manufacture substitute gratifications for themselves in their symptoms, which, however, are either painful in themselves or become the cause of suffering, owing to the difficulties they create with the person's environment and society at large. It is easy to understand the latter fact, but the former presents us with a new problem. But culture demands other sacrifices besides that of sexual gratifications. We have regarded the difficulties in the development of civilization as part of the general difficulty accompanying all evolution, for we have traced them to the inertia of libido, its disinclination to relinquish an old position in favor of a new one. It is much the same thing if we say that the conflict between civilization and sexuality is caused by the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two people, in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas civilization is founded on relations between larger groups of persons. When a love relationship is at its height, no room is left for any interest in the surrounding world. The pair of lovers are sufficient unto themselves, do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy. In no other case does Eros so plainly betray the core of his being, his aim of making one out of many. But when he has achieved it in the proverbial way, through the love of two human beings, he is not willing to go further. From all this, we might well imagine that a civilized community could consist of pairs of individuals, such as this, libidinally satisfied in each other, and linked to all the others by work and common interests. If this were so, culture would not need to levy energy from sexuality, but such a desirable state of things does not exist, and never has existed. In actuality, culture is not content with such limited ties as these. We see that it endeavors to bind the members of the community to one another by libidinal ties as well. It makes use of every means and favors every avenue by which powerful identifications can be created among them, and that it exacts a heavy toll of aim-inhibited libido in order to strengthen communities by bonds of friendship between the members. We may find the clue in one of the so-called ideal standards of civilized society. It runs, "You shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." It is world-renowned, undoubtedly older than Christianity, which parades it as its proudest profession, yet certainly not very old. We will adopt a naive attitude towards it, as if we were meeting it for the first time. Thereupon, we find ourselves unable to suppress a feeling of astonishment as at something unnatural. Why should we do this? What good is it to us? Above all, how can we do such a thing? My love seems to me a valuable thing that I have no right to throw away without reflection. It imposes obligations on me, which I must be prepared to make sacrifices to fulfill. If I love someone, he must be worthy of it in some way or other. He will be worthy if he is so like me in important respects that I can love myself in him. Worthy of it if he is so much more perfect than I, that I can love my ideal of myself in him. But if he is a stranger to me and cannot attract me by any value he has in himself, it will be hard for me to love him. When I look more closely, I find still further difficulties. Not merely is this stranger, on the whole, not worthy of love, but to be honest, I must confess, he has more claim to my hostility, even to my hatred. He does not seem to care for my love, to have the least trace of love for me, does not show me the slightest consideration. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me. What is more, he does not even need to get an advantage from it. If he can merely get a little pleasure out of it, he thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, showing his power over me. if the high-sounding ordinance had run, "Love thy neighbor as thy neighbor loves thee." Now it is, of course, very probable that my neighbor, when he is commanded to love me as himself, will answer exactly as I have done, as long as these undeniable variations have not been abolished. Conformity to the highest ethical standards constitutes a betrayal of the interests of culture, for it puts a direct premium on wickedness. One is irresistibly reminded here of an incident in the French chamber when capital punishment was being discussed. The speech of a member who had passionately supported its abolition was being applauded with loud acclamation when suddenly a voice was heard, calling out from the back of the room, "The bit of truth," I said, "behind all this, one so eagerly denied, is that men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love, who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but that a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. The result is that their neighbor is to them not only a possible helper or sexual object, but also a temptation to them to gratify their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without recompense, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. Who has the courage to dispute it in the face of all the evidence in his own life and in history? This aggressive cruelty usually lies in wait for some provocation, or else it steps into the service of some other purpose. In circumstances that favor it, when those forces in the mind which ordinarily inhibit it cease to operate, it also manifests itself spontaneously and reveals men as savage beasts to whom the thought of sparing their own kind is alien. Anyone who calls to mind the atrocities of the early migrations, of the invasion by the Huns, or by the so-called Mongols under Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, of the sack of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders, even indeed the horrors of the last World War, will have to bow his head humbly before the truth of this view of man. The existence of this tendency to aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and rightly presume to be present in others, is the factor that disturbs our relations with our neighbors and makes it necessary for culture to institute its high demands. Civilized society is perpetually menaced with disintegration through this primary hostility of men towards one another. Their interests in their common work would not hold them together. The passions of instinct are stronger than reasoned interests. Culture has to call up every possible reinforcement in order to erect barriers against the aggressive instincts of men and hold their manifestations in check by reaction formations in men's minds. Hence its system of methods, by which mankind is to be driven to identifications and aim-inhibited love relationships. Hence the restrictions on sexual life, and hence, too, its ideal command to love one's neighbor as oneself, which is really justified by the fact that nothing is so completely at variance with original human nature as this. With all its striving, this endeavor of cultures has so far not achieved very much. Civilization expects to prevent the worst atrocities of brutal violence by taking upon itself the right to employ violence against criminals. But the law is not able to lay hands on the more discreet and subtle forms in which human aggressions are expressed. The time comes when every one of us has to abandon the illusory anticipations with which in our youth we regarded our fellow men, and when we realize how much hardship and suffering we have been caused in life through their ill will. The communists believe they have found a way of delivering us from this evil. Man is wholeheartedly good and friendly to his neighbor, they say, but the system of private property has corrupted his nature. The possession of private property gives power to the individual, and thence the temptation arises to ill-treat his neighbor. The man who is excluded from the possession of property is obliged to rebel in hostility against the oppressor. If private property were abolished, all valuables held in common, and all allowed to share in the enjoyment of them, ill will and enmity would disappear from among men. Since all needs would be satisfied, none would have any reason to regard another as an enemy. All would willingly undertake the work which is necessary. I have no concern with any economic criticisms of the communistic system. I cannot inquire into whether the abolition of private property is advantageous and expedient. But I am able to recognize that psychologically it is founded on an untenable illusion. By abolishing private property, one deprives the human love of aggression, of one of its instruments, I said. A strong one, undoubtedly, but assuredly not the strongest. It in no way alters the individual differences in power, which are turned by aggressiveness to its own use. Nor does it change the nature of the instinct in any way. This instinct did not arise as the result of property. It reigned almost supreme in primitive times, when possessions were still extremely scanty. It shows itself already in the nursery, when possessions have hardly grown out of their original anal shape. It is at the bottom of all the relations of affection and love between human beings, possibly with the single exception of that of a mother to her male child. Suppose that personal rights to material goods are done away with. There still remain prerogatives in sexual relationships which must arouse the strongest rancor and most violent enmity among men and women who are otherwise equal. Men clearly do not find it easy to do without satisfaction of this tendency to aggression that is in them. When deprived of satisfaction of it, they are ill at ease. There is an advantage, not to be undervalued, in the existence of smaller communities, through which the aggressive instinct can find an outlet in enmity towards those outside the group. It is always possible to unite considerable numbers of men in love towards one another, so long as there are still some remaining as objects for aggressive manifestations. Peoples whose territories are adjacent and are otherwise closely related are always at feud and ridiculing each other. The Spaniards and the Portuguese, the North and South Germans, the English and the Scotch. I gave it the name of narcissism in respect of minor differences, which does not do much to explain it. One can now see that it is a convenient and relatively harmless form of satisfaction for aggressive tendencies, through which cohesion amongst the members of a group is made easier. Once the Apostle Paul had laid down universal love between all men as the foundation of his Christian community. The inevitable consequence in Christianity was the utmost intolerance towards all who remained outside of it. The Romans, who had not founded their state on love, were not given to lack of religious toleration. Neither was it an unaccountable chance that the dream of a German world dominion evoked a complementary movement towards anti-Semitism, and it is quite intelligible that the attempt to establish a new communistic type of culture in Russia should find psychological support in the persecution of the bourgeois. One only wonders, with some concern, however, how the Soviets will manage when they have exterminated their bourgeois entirely. If civilization requires such sacrifices, not only of sexuality, but also of the aggressive tendencies in mankind, we can better understand why it should be so hard for men to feel happy in it. In actual fact, primitive man was better off in this respect, for he knew nothing of any restrictions on his instincts. As a set-off, I said, against this his prospects of enjoying his happiness for any length of time were very slight. Civilized man has exchanged some part of his chances of happiness for a measure of security. We will not forget, however, that in the primal family, only the head of it enjoyed this instinctual freedom. The other members lived in slavish thraldom. The antithesis between a minority enjoying cultural advantages and a majority who are robbed of them was therefore most extreme in that primeval period of culture. To the primitive human types living at the present time, careful investigation has revealed that their instinctual life is by no means to be envied on account of its freedom. It is subject to restrictions of a different kind, but perhaps even more rigorous than is that of modern civilized man. In rightly finding fault, as we thus do, with our present state of civilization, for so inadequately providing us with what we require to make us happy in life, and for the amount of suffering of a probably avoidable nature it lays us open to. In doing our utmost to lay bare the roots of its deficiencies by our unsparing criticisms, we are undoubtedly exercising our just rights and not showing ourselves enemies of culture. We may expect that in the course of time, changes will be carried out in our civilization, so that it becomes more satisfying to our needs and no longer open to the reproaches we have made against it. But perhaps we shall also accustom ourselves to the idea that there are certain difficulties inherent in the very nature of culture, which will not yield to any efforts at reform. Over and above the obligations of putting restrictions upon our instincts, which we see to be inevitable, we are imminently threatened with the dangers of a state one may call la misère psychologique of groups. This danger is most menacing, where the social forces of cohesion consist predominantly of identifications of the individuals in the group with one another, whilst leading personalities fail to acquire the significance that should fall to them in the process of group formation. The state of civilization in America at the present day offers a good opportunity for studying this injurious effect of civilization, which we have reason to dread. But I will resist the temptation to enter upon a criticism of American culture. I have no desire to give the impression that I would employ American methods myself. Never before, I said, in any of my previous writings, have I had the feeling so strongly as I have now that what I am describing is common knowledge, that I am requisitioning paper and ink, and in due course the labor of compositors and printers, in order to expound things that in themselves are obvious. The whole of analytic theory has evolved gradually enough, but the theory of instincts has groped its way forward under greater difficulties than any other part of it. In my utter perplexity at the beginning, I took as my starting point the poet-philosopher Schiller's aphorism that hunger and love make the world go round. Hunger would serve to represent those instincts which aim at preservation of the individual. Love seeks for objects, its chief function, which is favored in every way by nature, is preservation of the species. Thus first arose the contrast between ego instincts and object instincts. For the energy of the latter instincts, and exclusively for them, I introduce the term libido. One of these object instincts, the sadistic, certainly stood out from the rest, in that its aim was so very unloving. In spite of this, sadism plainly belonged to sexual life. The game of cruelty could take the place of the game of love. Neurosis appeared as the outcome of a struggle between the interests of self-preservation and the claims of libido, a struggle in which the ego was victorious, but at the price of great suffering and renunciations. A cardinal point in this advance was the introduction of the concept of narcissism, the idea that libido affects the ego itself, that its first dwelling place was in the ego, and that the latter remains its permanent headquarters. I made the next step in beyond the pleasure principle when the repetition compulsion and the conservative character of instinctual life first struck me. I drew the conclusion that beside the instinct, preserving the organic substance and binding it into ever larger units, there must exist another, in antithesis to this, which would seek to dissolve these units and reinstate their antecedent inorganic state. That is to say, a death instinct as well as Eros. The phenomena of life would then be explicable from the interplay of the two and their counteracting effects on each other. It was not easy, however, to demonstrate the working of this hypothetical death instinct. The manifestations of Eros were conspicuous and audible enough. One might assume that the death instinct worked silently within the organism towards its disintegration. But that, of course, was no proof. The idea that part of the instinct became directed towards the outer world, and then showed itself as an instinct of aggression and destruction, carried us a step further. The instinct, I said, would thus itself have been pressed into the service of Eros, in that the organism would be destroying something, animate or inanimate, outside itself, instead of itself. Conversely, any cessation of this flow outwards must have the effect of intensifying the self-destruction, which in any case would always be going on within. From this example, one could then surmise that the two kinds of instincts seldom, perhaps never, appear in isolation, but always mingle with each other in different, very varying proportions, and so make themselves unrecognizable to us. Sadism, long since known to us as a component instinct of sexuality, would represent a particularly strong admixture of the instinct of destruction into the love impulse, while its counterpart, masochism, would be an alliance between sexuality and the destruction at work within the self. In consequence of which the otherwise imperceptible destructive trend became directly evident and palpable. The assumption of the existence of a death instinct or a destruction instinct has roused opposition, even in analytical circles. I know that there is a great tendency to ascribe all that is dangerous and hostile in love rather to a fundamental bipolarity in its own nature. The conceptions I have summarized here I first put forward only tentatively, but in the course of time they have won such a hold over me that I can no longer think in any other way. To my mind, they are theoretically far more fruitful than any others it is possible to employ. They provide us with that simplification without either ignoring or doing violence to the facts. I know that we have always had before our eyes manifestations of the destruction instinct fused with erotism, but I can no longer understand how we could have overlooked the universality of non-erotic aggression and destruction, and could have omitted to give it its due significance in our interpretation of life. Those who love fairy tales do not like it when people speak of the innate tendencies in mankind towards aggression, destruction, and in addition, cruelty. For God has made them in his own image, with his own perfections. No one wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil with his omnipotence and supreme goodness. The devil is, in fact, the best way out in acquittal of God. He can be used to play the same economic role of outlet as Jews in the world of Aryan ideals. But even so, one can just as well hold God responsible for the existence of the devil as for the evil he personifies. In view of these difficulties, it is expedient for every man to make humble obeisance on suitable occasions in honor of the high-minded nature of men. It will assist him to become universally beloved, and much shall be forgiven unto him. The name libido, I said, can again be used to denote the manifestations of the power of Eros in contradistinction to the energy of the death instinct. We must confess that it is more difficult for us to detect the latter, and to a great extent we can merely conjecture its existence as a background to Eros. It eludes us wherever it is not betrayed by a fusion with Eros. In sadism, where it bends the erotic aim to its own will, and yet, at the same time, gratifies the sexual craving completely, we can obtain the clearest insight into its nature and its relation to Eros. But even where it shows itself without any sexual purpose, even in the blindest frenzy of destructiveness, one cannot ignore the fact that satisfaction of it is accompanied by an extraordinarily intense narcissistic enjoyment, due to the fulfillment it brings to the ego of its oldest omnipotence wishes. The instinct of destruction, when tempered and harnessed, as it were, inhibited in its aim, and directed towards objects, is compelled to provide the ego with satisfaction of its needs, and with power over nature, since the assumption of its existence is based essentially on theoretical grounds. It must be confessed that it is not entirely proof against theoretical objections. But this is how things appear to us now, in the present state of our knowledge. In all that follows, I take up the standpoint that the tendency to aggression is an innate, independent, instinctual disposition in man. And I come back now to the statement that it constitutes the most powerful obstacle to culture. Culture was a peculiar process passing over human life. We may add to this that the process proves to be in the service of Eros, which aims at binding together single human individuals. Then tribes, races, nations, into one great unity, that of humanity. Why this has to be done, we do not know. It is simply the work of Eros. These masses of men must be bound to one another libidinally. Necessity alone, the advantages of common work, would not hold them together. The natural instinct of aggressiveness in man, the hostility of each one against all, and of all against each one, opposes this program of civilization. And now, it seems to me, the meaning of the evolution of culture is no longer a riddle to us. It must present to us the struggle between Eros and death, between the instincts of life and the instincts of destruction. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and it is this battle of the Titans that our nurses and governesses try to compose with their lullaby song of heaven. Why do the animals, I said, akin to ourselves, not manifest any such cultural struggle? Oh, we don't know. Very probably, certain of them, bees, ants, termites, had to strive for thousands of centuries before they found the way to those state institutions. That division of functions, those restrictions upon individuals, which we admire them for today. It is characteristic of our present state that we know by our own feelings that we should not think ourselves happy in any of these communities of the animal world, or in any of the roles they delegate to individuals. In primitive man, a fresh access of libido may have kindled a new spurt of energy on the part of the instinct of destruction. What means does civilization make use of to hold in check the aggressiveness that opposes it? To make it harmless, perhaps to get rid of it? We can study it in the evolution of the individual. What happens in him to render his craving for aggression innocuous? Something very curious that we should never have guessed, and that yet seems simple enough. The aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. In fact, it is sent back where it came from, directed against the ego. It is there taken over by a part of the ego that distinguishes itself from the rest as a superego, and now in the form of conscience, exercises the same propensity to harsh aggressiveness against the ego that the ego would have liked to enjoy against others. The tension between the strict superego and the subordinate ego we call the sense of guilt. It manifests itself as the need for punishment. Civilization therefore obtains the mastery over the dangerous love of aggression in individuals by enfeebling and disarming it, and setting up an institution within their minds to keep watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. As to the origin of the sense of guilt, analysts have different views from those of the psychologists. First of all, when one asks how a sense of guilt arises in anyone, one is told something one cannot dispute. People feel guilty. Pious people call it sinful when they have done something they know to be bad. But then one sees how little this answer tells one. Perhaps after some hesitation, one will add that a person who has not actually committed a bad act, but has merely become aware of the intention to do so, can also hold himself guilty. And then one will ask why in this case the intention is counted as equivalent to the deed. How is this judgment arrived at? One may reject the suggestion of an original, as one might say natural, capacity for discriminating between good and evil. Evil is often not at all that which would injure or endanger the ego. On the contrary, it can also be something that it desires, that would give it pleasure. An extraneous influence is evidently at work. It is this that decides what is to be called good and bad, since their own feelings would not have led men along the same path. They must have had a motive for obeying this extraneous influence. It is easy to discover, I said, this motive in man's helplessness and dependence upon others. It can best be designated the dread of losing love. If he loses the love of others on whom he is dependent, he will forfeit also their protection against many dangers. And above all, he runs the risk that this stronger person will show his superiority in the form of punishing him. What is bad is, therefore, to begin with, whatever causes one to be threatened with a loss of love. Because of the dread of this loss, one must desist from it. That is why it makes little difference whether one has already committed the bad deed or only intends to do so. We call this state of mind a bad conscience, but actually it does not deserve this name, for at this stage the sense of guilt is obviously only the dread of losing love, social anxiety. In a little child, it can never be anything else. But in many adults, too, it has only changed insofar as the larger human community takes the place of the father or of both parents. Consequently, such people habitually permit themselves to do any bad deed that procures them something they want, if only they are sure that no authority will discover it. A great change takes place as soon as the authority has been internalized by the development of a superego. At this point, the dread of discovery ceases to operate, and also, once for all, any difference between doing evil and wishing to do it, since nothing is hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. The superego torments the sinful ego with the same feelings of dread and watches for opportunities whereby the outer world can be made to punish it. At this second stage of development, conscience exhibits a peculiarity which was absent in the first and is not very easy to account for. That is, the more righteous a man is, the stricter and more suspicious will his conscience be, so that ultimately it is precisely those people who have carried holiness farthest, who reproach themselves with the deepest sinfulness. Virtue forfeits some of her promised reward. The submissive and abstemious ego does not enjoy the trust of its mentor. Misfortune, i.e., external deprivation, greatly intensifies the strength of conscience in the superego. As long as things go well, his conscience is lenient. When some calamity befalls, he holds an inquisition within, discovers his sin, heightens the standards of his conscience. Fate is felt to be a substitute for the agency of the parents. Adversity means that one is no longer loved by this highest power of all. The people of Israel believe themselves to be God's favorite child, and when the great Father hurled visitation after visitation upon them, they proceeded instead to bring their prophets into the world, to declare their sinfulness to them, and out of their sense of guilt, they constructed the stringent commandments of their priestly religion. It is curious how differently a savage behaves. If he has had bad fortune, he does not throw the blame on himself, but on his fetish, who has plainly not done his duty, and he belabors it instead of punishing himself. Hence, we know, I said, of two sources for feelings of guilt, that arising from the dread of authority, and the later one from the dread of the superego. The first one compels us to renounce instinctual gratification. The other presses over and above this towards punishment. Since the persistence of forbidden wishes cannot be concealed from the superego, we have also heard how the severity of the superego, the rigor of conscience, is to be explained. It simply carries on the severity of external authority, which it has succeeded and to some extent replaced. Originally, it is true, renunciation is the consequence of a dread of external authority. One gives up pleasures so as not to lose its love. Having made this renunciation, what is quits with authority, so to speak, no feeling of guilt should remain. But with the dread of the superego, the case is different. Renunciation of gratification does not suffice here, for the wish persists and is not capable of being hidden from the superego. In spite of the renunciations made, feelings of guilt will be experienced, and this is a great disadvantage, economically, of the erection of the superego. Renunciation no longer has a completely absolving effect. Virtuous restraint is no longer rewarded by the assurance of love. A threatened external unhappiness, loss of love and punishment, has been exchanged for a lasting inner unhappiness. The tension of a sense of guilt. The chronological sequence would thus be as follows: instinct renunciation, due to dread of an aggression by external authority; the erection of an internal authority; instinctual renunciation due to dread of it, that is, dread of conscience. There is the equivalence of wicked acts and wicked intentions. Hence comes the sense of guilt, the need for punishment. The aggressiveness of conscience carries on the aggressiveness of authority. And here, at last, comes in an idea which is quite peculiar to psychoanalysis. In the beginning, conscience was the cause of instinctual renunciation, but later, this relation is reversed. Every renunciation then becomes a dynamic fount of conscience. Every fresh abandonment of gratification increases its severity and intolerance. We should be tempted to make the following paradoxical statement: conscience is the result of instinctual renunciation. Renunciation gives rise to conscience, which then demands further renunciations. The contradiction, I said, between this proposition and our previous knowledge about the genesis of conscience is not in actual fact so very great, and we can see a way in which it may be still further reduced. In order to state the problem more easily, let us select the example of the instinct of aggression. The effect of instinctual renunciation on conscience then operates as follows. Every impulse of aggression which we omit to gratify is taken over by the superego and goes to heighten its aggressiveness against the ego. When authority prevented the child from enjoying the first but most important gratifications of all, aggressive impulses of considerable intensity must have been evoked in it. The child must necessarily have had to give up the satisfaction of these revengeful, aggressive wishes. In this situation, in which it is economically so hard-pressed, it has recourse to certain mechanisms well known to us. By the process of identification, it absorbs into itself the invulnerable authority, which then becomes the superego and comes into possession of all the aggressiveness which the child would gladly have exercised against it. The child's ego has to content itself with the unhappy role of the authority, the father, who has been thus degraded. It is, as so often, a reversal of the original situation. If I were father, and you my child, I would treat you badly. The relation between superego and ego is a reproduction, distorted by a wish of the real relations between the ego and an external object. The essential difference, however, is that the original severity of the superego does not, or not so much, represent the severity which has been experienced or anticipated from the object, but expresses the child's own aggressiveness towards the latter. Conscience is formed in the beginning from the suppression of an aggressive impulse, and strengthened as time goes on by each fresh suppression of the kind. Experience has shown, however, that the severity which a child's superego develops in no way corresponds to the severity of the treatment it has itself experienced. A child which has been very leniently treated can acquire a very strict conscience. But it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. Strict upbringing also has a strong influence on the formation of a child's superego. The development of conscience is determined in part by innate constitutional factors, and in part by the influence of the actual environment. And that is in no way surprising. On the contrary, it is the invariable etiological condition of all such processes. It may also be said, I said, that when a child reacts to the first great instinctual deprivations with an excessive aggressiveness and a corresponding strictness of its superego, it is thereby following a phylogenetic prototype, unheedful of what reaction would in reality be justified. For the father of primitive times was certainly terrifying, and one may safely attribute the utmost degree of aggressiveness to him. But then, on the other hand, we find a new important difference between the two processes. We cannot disregard the conclusion that man's sense of guilt has its origin in the Oedipus complex and was acquired when the father was killed by the association of the brothers. At that time, the aggression was not suppressed, but carried out, and it is this same act of aggression whose suppression in the child we regard as the source of feelings of guilt. Now, I should not be surprised if a reader were to cry out angrily, "So it makes no difference whether one does kill one's father or does not. One gets a feeling of guilt in either case." Here, I should think one may be allowed some doubts. Either it is not true that guilt is evoked by suppressed aggressiveness, or else the whole story about the father murder is a romance, and primeval man did not kill his father any more often than people do nowadays. When one has feelings of guilt after one has committed some crime, and because of it, this feeling should more properly be called remorse. It relates only to the one act, and clearly it presupposes that conscience, the capacity for feelings of guilt, was already in existence before the deed. But if man's sense of guilt goes back to the murder of the father, that was undoubtedly an instance of remorse. Where did the remorse come from then? This remorse was the result of the very earliest primal ambivalence of feelings towards the father. The sons hated him, but they loved him too. After their hate against him had been satisfied by their aggressive acts, their love came to expression in their remorse about the deed, set up the superego by identification with the father, gave it the father's power to punish as he would have done the aggression they had performed. At this point, it seems to me, we can at last clearly perceive the part played by love in the origin of conscience and the fatal inevitableness of the sense of guilt. It is not really a decisive matter whether one has killed one's father or abstained from the deed. One must feel guilty in either case, for guilt is the expression of the conflict of ambivalence, the eternal struggle between Eros and the destructive or death instinct. Since culture obeys an inner erotic impulse which bids it bind mankind into a closely knit mass, it can achieve this aim only by means of its vigilance in fomenting an ever-increasing sense of guilt. That which began in relation to the father ends in relation to the community. An intensification of the sense of guilt will be inextricably bound up with it, until perhaps the sense of guilt may swell to a magnitude that individuals can hardly support. One is reminded of the telling accusation made by the great poet against the heavenly forces. Ye set our feet on this life's road. Ye watch our guilty, erring courses. Then leave us, bowed beneath our load, for earth its every debt enforces. On reaching the end, I said, of such a journey as this, the author must beg his readers to pardon him for not having been a more skillful guide, not sparing them bleak stretches of country at times, and laborious detours at others. There is no doubt that it could have been done better. First of all, I suspect the reader feels that the discussion about the sense of guilt oversteps its proper boundaries. It faithfully corresponds to my intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the evolution of culture, and to convey that the price of progress in civilization is paid in forfeiting happiness for the heightening of the sense of guilt. At bottom, the sense of guilt is nothing but a topographical variety of anxiety, and that in its later phases it coincides completely with the dread of the superego. The sense of guilt produced by culture is not perceived as such and remains to a great extent unconscious, or comes to expression as a sort of uneasiness or discontent for which other motivations are sought. The superego is an agency or institution in the mind whose existence we have inferred. Conscience is a function we ascribe, among others, to the superego. It consists of watching over and judging the actions and intentions of the ego, exercising the functions of a censor. The anxiety that lies behind all these relations, the dread of that critical institution, the need for punishment, is an instinctual manifestation on the part of the ego, which has become masochistic under the influence of the sadistic superego. It has brought a part of the instinct of destruction at work within itself into the service of an erotic attachment to the superego. Remorse is to be reserved for the reaction after an actual performance of an aggressive deed. After this, the omniscience of the superego robbed the distinction between intended aggressions and aggressions committed of its significance. A mere intention to commit an act of violence could then evoke a sense of guilt. The aggressive energy with which one imagined the superego to be endowed was a continuation of the punitive energy belonging to external authority, whereas, according to another view, it consisted of aggressive energy originating in the self, leveled against this inhibiting authority, but not allowed to discharge itself in actions. What remained as essential and common to both was that in both cases we were dealing with an aggression that had been turned inward. The thwarting, I said, of the erotic gratification provokes an access of aggressiveness against the person who interfered with the gratification, and then this tendency to aggression in its turn has itself to be suppressed. So then it is, after all, only the aggression which is changed into guilt by being suppressed and made over to the superego. I am convinced that very many processes will admit of much simpler and clearer explanation if we restrict our findings to the aggressive instincts. The symptoms of neurosis are essentially substitutive gratifications for unfulfilled sexual wishes. Every neurosis masks a certain amount of unconscious sense of guilt, which in its turn reinforces the symptoms by exploiting them as punishment. When an instinctual trend undergoes repression, its libidinal elements are transformed into symptoms, into a sense of guilt. Some readers of this essay, too, may be under the impression that the formula of the struggle between Eros and the death instinct has been reiterated too often. It is supposed to characterize the cultural process which evolves in humanity, but it has been related also to the development of the individual. And besides this, it is supposed to have revealed the secret of organic life in general. The cultural process is the particular modification undergone by the life process under the influence of the task set before it by Eros and stimulated by Ananke, external necessity. And this task is that of uniting single human beings into a larger unity with libidinal attachments between them. The development of the individual is ordered according to the program laid down by the pleasure principle, namely the attainment of happiness. The incorporation of the individual as a member of a community seems like an almost unavoidable condition which has to be filled before he can attain this objective of happiness. Individual development seems to us a product of the interplay of two trends: the striving for happiness, generally called egoistic, the impulse towards merging with others, which we call altruistic. But things are different in the development of culture. Here, far the most important aim is that of creating a single unity out of individual men and women, while the objective of happiness, though still present, is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if humanity could be most successfully united into one great whole if there were no need to trouble about the happiness of individuals. Just as a planet, I said, circles round its central body while at the same time rotating on its own axis, so the individual man takes his part in the course of humanity's development as he goes on his way through life. But to our dull eyes, the play of forces in the heavens seems set fast in a never-varying scheme. So in every individual, the two trends, one towards personal happiness and the other towards unity with the rest of humanity, must contend with each other. This struggle between individual and society is not derived from the antagonism of the primal instincts, Eros and death, which are probably irreconcilable. It is a dissension in the camp of the libido itself, comparable to the contest between the ego and its objects for a share of the libido, and it does eventually admit of a solution in the individual, as we may hope it will also do in the future of civilization. The analogy between the process of cultural evolution and the path of individual development may be carried further. It can be maintained that the community too develops a superego, under whose influence cultural evolution proceeds. The superego of any given epoch of civilization originates in the same way as that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind them by great leading personalities, men of outstanding force of mind, or men in whom some one human tendency has developed in unusual strength and purity. In many instances, the analogy goes still further, in that during their lives, such persons are ridiculed by others, ill-used, or even cruelly done to death, just as happened with the primal father, who also rose again to become a deity long after his death by violence. The most striking example of this double fate is the figure of Jesus Christ. If indeed it does not itself belong to the realm of mythology, which called it into being out of a dim memory of that primordial event, the cultural superego has elaborated its ideals and erected its standards. Those of its demands, which deal with the relations of human beings to one another, are comprised under the name of ethics. The greatest value has at all times been set upon systems of ethics. Ethics must be regarded, therefore, as a therapeutic effort, as an endeavor to achieve something through the standards imposed by the superego, which had not been attained by the work of civilization in other ways. The question is, how to dislodge the greatest obstacle to civilization, the constitutional tendency in men to aggressions against one another, and for that very reason, the commandment to love one's neighbor. As thyself, I said, probably the most recent of the cultural superego's demands, is especially interesting to us. In our investigations and our therapy of the neuroses, we cannot avoid finding fault with the superego of the individual on two counts. In commanding and prohibiting with such severity, it troubles too little about the happiness of the ego, and it fails to take into account sufficiently the difficulties in the way of obeying it, the strength of instinctual cravings in the ID, and the hardships of the external environment. The cultural superego enjoins a command and never asks whether or not it is possible for them to obey it. It presumes that a man's ego is psychologically capable of anything that is required of it, that his ego has unlimited power over his ID. This is an error. Even in so-called normal people, the power of controlling the id cannot be increased beyond certain limits. The command to love our neighbors as ourselves is the strongest defense there is against human aggressiveness. It is a superlative example of the unpsychological attitude of the cultural superego. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value and not remedy the evil. Civilization pays no heed to all this. It merely prates that the harder it is to obey, the more laudable the obedience. What an overwhelming obstacle to civilization aggression must be if the defense against it can cause as much misery as aggression itself. Would not the diagnosis be justified that many systems of civilization, possibly even the whole of humanity, have become neurotic under the pressure of the civilizing trends? The diagnosis of collective neuroses will be confronted by a special difficulty. In the neurosis of an individual, we can use as a starting point the contrast between the patient and his environment, which we assume to be normal. No such background as this would be available for any society. I have endeavored to guard myself against the enthusiastic partiality which believes our civilization to be the most precious thing that we possess. My courage fails me, therefore, at the thought of rising up as a prophet before my fellow men, and I'll bow to their reproach that I have no consolation to offer them. For at bottom, this is what they all demand: the frenzied revolutionary as passionately as the most pious believer. The fateful question of the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent the cultural process will succeed in mastering the derangements of communal life caused by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. Men have brought their powers of subduing the forces of nature to such a pitch that by using them, they could now very easily exterminate one another to the last man. They know this. A great part of their current unrest, their dejection, their mood of apprehension, and now it may be expected that the other of the two heavenly forces, eternal Eros, will put forth his strength so as to maintain himself alongside of his equally immortal adversary. We have reached the end of the journey. We stand on a planet armed with the powers of the gods, but driven by the hunger of the beast. We are sick with guilt. We are heavy with laws, and we shiver at the strength of our own hands. Will love save us, or will the death instinct finally claim its debt? thank you for finishing this masterpiece with me. If Freud's final warning that we now possess the power to exterminate ourselves has made you feel the dejection and apprehension of our age, then you have finally understood the discontent of civilization. Subscribe to the Classic Mind, where we strip away the illusions of safety to find the titans still at war. Like the video if you believe that Eros must prevail. And tell me in the comments, in the battle between the strength to build and the power to destroy, which heavenly force is winning in your world? I am Jamil, and this was the Classic Mind.